All right, guys, welcome back. Our next artist up for bids here really needs no introduction. Vincent van Gogh, a Dutch painter who basically arrives late to the tradition of painting, is going to have a quite, I guess we could say, turbid life. That basically is going to inform works of art that make it into our collection. So I would probably want to start by saying just be careful with the stuff that you're seeing online with Vincent van Gogh. A lot of stuff romanticizes him without really talking about his style or his approach. With Vincent van Gogh, guys, we've tripped over into the world of post Impressionism, and that's a really big point that I want to stress. Post Impressionism shares similarities with its prior movement in the way that it approaches color and texture, but it moves much more into the world of the psychology of color and goes beyond just trying to catch the effects of atmosphere on surface like a Monet or a Cassatt. We're really talking about seeing the world differently and imbuing that world or electrifying that world with a color palette that creates in our minds, the viewer, the tone that the artist is trying to convey with the selected subject matter and color palette. And it really gets into the world of psychoanalysis as we look at the works by Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Munch, which we'll look at later. So I want you to be familiar with post-impressionism. Some of the videos that I've attached for you on the side there will help you with that. You really need to draw a sharp line between the two movements because we've kind of moved on to a pre-20th century kind of notion of the world, where what the artist sees is not necessarily what the viewer sees in the normal situation. It's almost like a ripping away of the surface and revealing the truth that's underneath. So we'll talk more about post-impressionism and symbolism, but we're going to get back to Van Gogh right now. Whenever I show this to students, they're always surprised to find out that this is actually an early Van Gogh. And I want to remind you guys that originally, when he emerges on the scene, he wants to be a realist painter. He wants to go back to the mid-century. It's already 1880. He's arriving to the scene a little bit late after his other contemporaries, and he wants to try his hand at painting. Now, originally, his father wanted him to go into law. That was a different fit, a difficult fit. Didn't work out too well. He then decides that he wants to go into religion and theology and eventually maybe even run a parish church. He's successful in getting like a parish church to run, but the people complain that he's too meticulous, that he's too intense, that he's just almost too mental to be friendly to the people, and he loses that job pretty quickly. This painting kind of celebrates, I think, or at least pays homage to that episode in his life. The book that you're reading there is a large Bible that was owned by his father. The book that's on the right, the little novel there, is called The Joy of Life, and it seems to kind of present two rivaling schools of thought, and definitely concerns for Van Gogh during his time there. But the color palette would completely throw you off of browns and acid greens and dark tones, because that's not what we know of Van Gogh after he moves to Arles. But when he goes to Paris to kind of study alongside all the other avant-garde painters of the late 19th century, he really wants to persist with this idea or notion of things that have been used, have a story. And that's his shoes that he walked and tramped all over the city of Paris with. In a way, the way that they're rusticated and shown in thick colors of impasto kind of documents the places that they've traveled and the scuffs that have come from stepping off a curb here or stepping into water there. They kind of become a synonymous symbol for him. And we're beginning to see him delve into objects that really say more than just what they are. So this is the process beginning. The very first work that people kind of knew Van Gogh for was this thing called The Potato Eaters. And it seemed to be kind of an update of realism. It's a little off-putting when you know a Van Gogh from later years because of the color palette and the somber subject matter. These people are eating a meager meal of potatoes in an interior that looks nothing like the south of France. But this is what he first sees himself doing, becoming someone who paints expressionistically like Courbet, and updates the model for the new avant-garde. But so introduce Japanese May, basically just like everybody else who's seeing all of these wonderful woodblock print shows. Van Gogh is definitely influenced by that, to the point that he copies a work like this and a work like that from the original without really even knowing what Japanese letters mean or what they imply. He adopts the thick lines, the contour lines, as well as the flat fields of color from the printmaking process, and begins to kind of conceptualize of this as not a window on the world, but more like a composition, like an arrangement of color that the artist gets to choose and create himself, whether or not it actually depicts the real world. Here is a self-portrait of Van Gogh as a Buddhist monk. He shaves his head, puts on a little brooch there that shows off the Buddha, and begins to kind of conceptualize of himself as like an East Asian thinker, seeking out that philosophy for guidance in his life at a time when he's seeking direction. He's trying to figure out what he's going to be as an artist. And we'll talk about Gauguin a little bit later. It's about that time that he decides to leave Paris behind. He's not been well accepted there, and he goes to the south of France. And it's the color palette of the south of France that really we know best from Van Gogh. These intense blues and yellows. Still keeping with the realist tradition here, he celebrates these exhausted workers in the field, kind of like Courbet's Stonebreakers, right? But the field is electric, and it reveals the kind of brushstrokes that you need to know for Van Gogh. They're short, they're quick, they're heavily applied, thick impasto brushstrokes that are not going to be blended in to show you like a refined photograph kind of painting. These are rough, they're edgy. They kind of innervate the surface of the canvas with electricity that's not visible, in the light of every day, right? We don't see people in the field looking like this, but we darn well know that that's the brushstroke of Van Gogh. It's a very different kind of application of paint. Thick colors are allowed to blend right next to each other. Here you see the cypress tree, which will be a theme for his Starry Night, which we'll talk about in a second. But all around the cypress tree, the landscape is alive with color and blues and greens and yellows. And that kind of electric energy is going to be something that's going to inspire expressionists in the early 20th century a little bit later. Here is a self-portrait, believe it or not. Vincent painted his chair and was celebrating what he thought was going to be a collaboration between himself and Gauguin. Gauguin was the more affluent painter, apparently, who had a little bit more success than Van Gogh at the time. And Van Gogh was trying to create a commune of artists in the south of France, in Arles, where he was kind of hanging out. He wanted this chair to represent his style and kind of stand in for him, the artist, as someone who was kind of the land and tied to nature. His tobacco pipe laying there open, ready to be, wrapped up and used. This kind of represents the summation of his style. And he was doing this to present it to Gauguin at the time. He wanted to show Gauguin that he could do Gauguin's style too. And you're going to see in the next video, Gauguin's emphasis was on thick, dark lines, contour lines that would divide up the compositions, and flat, vibrant fields of color where you don't see as much brushstroke work as you do with a Van Gogh. This was supposed to be a portrait of Gauguin by Van Gogh, and it was supposed to be one of the images that welcomed him to the new enclave of artists. But you guys know from the video, the Van Gogh ear video, that didn't go too well, so we'll talk about that in a minute. To make ready for Gauguin, we get this series of sunflowers. Guys, these sunflowers were throwaways that had been dumped out by the florist in the gutter. Van Gogh claims them, takes them, and basically puts them in an arrangement, and we get what most people call the Mona Lisas of still lifes. There's about 4 or 5 of these, and they were meant to decorate the house that Vincent and Gauguin were going to live in, while they worked and collaborated on creating a new avant-garde format. So I think it's really kind of interesting that now we celebrate these as masterworks of texture and color harmony that kind of bring forward the whole still life tradition. There are lots of these, and we know them well because they're in every museum in the world, right? So I want to move on to Starry, Starry Night. This self-portrait I'm always drawn to because it shows Van Gogh at the height of his, positive thinking about what was coming in the future. There's a nervous excitement and energy that's kind of synonymous with his style, as you see the brushstrokes that are electric all around him. He seems to be glowing in a way that seems more optimistic than what we know of him later. And that's at about the time he paints in the bedroom. This is a recollection. It's not literally done from observation, sitting there with the subject in front of you. He's already had a couple of bouts of depression and has been in the asylum a couple of times. And this is his recollection of a happy time. The color palettes are bright blue. You can see the chair that factored into his self-portrait is recalled. Some of his work is around the room, and he's got portraits as well as Japanese-made prints everywhere. On the stand, we see like a miniature, version of the things that he would use in the daily, preparation for getting ready. So it's kind of like a fond remembrance of the things that kind of made him productive and happier than the time that he finds himself in the asylum. It's already demonstrating some influences of Japanese-made guys. You notice the floor is tilted down so that we kind of see it from an aerial perspective, but then objects in the composition we see in profile. That blending of perspectives is something that comes to Europe from the Japanese-made tradition. So all right, the mood has changed. The yellows have disappeared, the more somber purples and blues have emerged, and now we're seeing the torment for Vincent van Gogh, basically trying to rest the fact that he hasn't sold many of his paintings, that his brother Theo, I think at this point, has sold one, and that he's just not achieving everything that he wants to. He goes into creating a series of night paintings where blues and darker tones begin to take over. You might recognize the Night Cafe, one of his more famous ones, but they really are synonymous with a turn away from the bright sunlight of day into the darker, more mercurial concerns of nighttime. I want to read you guys this quote from Gardner's, which is not our textbook, but one that we've used before. It kind of shows you the extent to which Van Gogh is really thinking not about what he sees in front of him, but about the psychology of the color that he's using in his compositions. It says, the letters of Vincent van Gogh. Throughout his life, Vincent van Gogh wrote letters to his brother Theo van Gogh, a Parisian art dealer, on matters both mundane and philosophical. The letters are precious documents of the vicissitudes of the painter's life and reveal his emotional anguish. In many of the letters, Van Gogh also forcefully stated his views about art. In one letter, he told Theo, in both my life and in my painting, I can very well do without God, but I cannot, ill as I am, do without something which is greater than I, the power to create. For Van Gogh, the power to create involved the expressive use of color. It says again in quotes, instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily so as to express myself forcibly. Color in painting, he argued, is not locally true from the point of view of the delusive realist, but color suggesting some emotion of an ardent temperament. Some of Van Gogh's letters contain vivid descriptions of his paintings, which are invaluable to art historians in gauging his intentions and judging his success. For example, about the Night Cafe, that's the work that you're looking at right now, he says, or he wrote, I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. The room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 citron yellow lamps with a glow of orange and green. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most disparate reds and greens and the figures of the little sleeping hooligans in the empty, dreary room in violet and blue. The blood red and the yellow green of the billiard table, for instance, contrast with the soft, tender Louis XV green on the counter, on which there is a pink nosegay. The white coat of the landlord, awake in the corner of that furnace, turns citron yellow or pale, luminous green. And what we're seeing is a real interplay of color that goes beyond just the subject matter into the psychology of how those colors make us feel. If Vincent is really sitting late into the evening in night cafes where people plot murders and assassinations and underhanded dealings, he's really trying to emphasize that through these desynchronous colors that we're going to see more of later on in Expressionism. Here, for example, we have one of his more famous depictions of a church. But guys, I don't see a door. This may be an attempt for him to wrestle with the past that he can no longer seem to connect with, and that he shows himself being kind of cut off from the rest of society. Basically, you know what this is about. This is the famous self-portrait with the bandaged ear. That episode you can find out more about by looking at the video, Secrets of the Dead video, the Vincent's ear. It dispels a lot of the rumors that Vincent was, crazy and debauched and doing what he did. He was very methodical, and he thought about everything in a symbolic kind of way. I like this portrait because look in the background. Look in the background and take a look at what he's put there specifically so that you would see it. That's a poster print of Japanese geishas out in front of Mount Fuji, and it emphasizes how important that kind of art making still is to him, even at this late stage in his life. So when we come to Starry Night, finally, right, we basically see a landscape in this new avant-garde style. Basically, the colors blue and yellow are predominant throughout the whole canvas, and it seems to be a night sky that is just alive and electric. The quote I'll read for you here in a second, but you're going to need to really understand the formal qualities of the impasto brushstrokes and the swirling lines of the night sky. They're in direct contrast to the blockish houses that seem rather fixed and low on the horizon. And notice that church. The church is dark, and maybe a reference to the fact that this is a world that's been cut off to him. The vertical of the church matches the vertical of the cypress tree that runs from the bottom of the painting to the top. A lot of art historians equate that upright cypress as kind of like a conduit, right? Cypress trees are usually what outline the areas around cemeteries, and they've become synonymous by this time with death and remembrance. That tree reaching from the land of the living up into the heavens basically provides a visual connection between the two realms, and may serve as a conduit for Vincent himself. They were always in his mind. This particular work, while we get lost in the technique, make no mistake, is a meditation about what's to come in Vincent's life. Given Van Gogh's determination to use color to express himself forcibly, the dark, deep blue that suffuses the entire painting cannot be overlooked. Together with the turbulent brushstrokes, the color suggests a quiet but pervasive depression. Van Gogh's written observation to his brother reveals his contemplative state of mind. Perhaps death is not the hardest thing in a painter's life. Looking at the stars always makes me dream, as simply as I dream over the black dots representing towns and villages on a map. Why, I ask myself, shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to get to Terrasson or Rouen, we take death to reach a star. Quotes like that make us realize that basically Van Gogh is thinking about everything in a much deeper way at the end of his life. His career spanned a period of 10 years, and he was prolific during that time. But after his death, he's relatively forgotten until the new century arrives. So what you're seeing basically is like a last hurrah. And this is, as far as I know, the last painting that Van Gogh paints here, this Field of Crows. The foreboding presence of those dark clouds matched with the dark gashes of crows as they fly across the field create a sense of kind of the finality of things, and had been used as a symbol for the end of life or approaching death. It's at this point that Van Gogh is either shot by someone or takes his own life. There are variations on the end of life in his story, but most people, when they see this, kind of contemplate Van Gogh's life ending in suicide. although that may not be the case given new scholarship that's been found. But we do know from the darkness of his writing about Starry Night that this was no long time coming, and it's a rather sad end to the story. I would recommend, if you guys are interested in finding out more about Van Gogh, maybe watching the movie Loving Vincent, or maybe seeing the most recent retelling of the Van Gogh story that features Willem Dafoe. You probably are familiar with the short little episode on Doctor Who that features Van Gogh being transported to the Musée d'Orsay for a retrospective of his work. That's especially poignant too. So I'll recommend those to you guys to look up online later. All right, I'm going to give you just a short little break, and then we will come back to look at the other side of the story with Gauguin.